So moving along here in our John David Ebert 101 class, last time we talked about what is metaphysics, and the theme this time also will be the same, part two of that discussion. And last time we talked about two different senses of metaphysics. Metaphysics of the kind that you encounter in the New Age section in a Barnes & Noble bookstore, the sort of kitschy version of metaphysics, versus metaphysics in the high conceptual philosophical sense as it is used by Heidegger when he designates the Western metaphysical age that extends from Plato to Nietzsche. All the great philosophers belong in that age. And then I want to move into a third sense of the word metaphysics here, which is the sense that I use quite a bit. And for that, what I would like to do is introduce Joseph Campbell's 4 different functions of myth. Campbell discusses mythology, and he says there's basically 4 different functions. And here, the two sort of mundane functions, terrestrial functions, are the sociological and the psychological functions. The sociological function has to do with myth validating a particular ethical system. In India, the metaphysical system there validates the caste system, but it doesn't work that way anywhere else. But each society has a different ethical system that it lives by, where the myths in that civilization sort of make that or validate that sociological system. They're all different. All the societies have different values, different ethical systems. And whereas the psychological function of myth then is this universal function of myth as pedagogy, myth guiding us along through the stages of life. You have to cross a threshold after the crisis of birth, which is threshold number 1. You have to go through the crisis of puberty. That's another threshold myth is designed to get you across. Then into maturity, maybe into midlife crises, you get divorced or whatever happens to you. Midlife, and then you have to cross over the threshold into old age and be psychologically prepared to deal with that, and then death, the ever-present looming threshold of death. So these are the psychological functions, and for Campbell, there really is no other psychologist other than Carl Jung. Campbell is a kind of Jungian, and Jung is his main guy for as far as psychology goes. Then the other 2 functions are cosmological and metaphysical. So Campbell's use of the term metaphysical here is the gateway that moves us on into my third definition of metaphysics. So the cosmological function, which we talked about a bit last time, has to do with the validation of a picture of the universe, where we're at in relation to it, what it looks like, and it has to be up to date, scientifically up to date, with whatever the particular culture's knowledge of the time is. Campbell used to say that there is no conflict between science and religion. The conflict is between the science of 2000 BC and the science of 2000 AD. The cosmologies of the Sumerians aren't going to map up onto a Stephen Hawking cosmology of an expanding universe of atoms and quantums and so forth. Einsteinian relativity is not going to work. So the cosmology has outgrown the ancient cosmology, but it is still possible to mythologize, perfectly possible. And of course, science fiction does this. Science fiction, as William Irwin Thompson used to say, is the mythology of science. That's what it is. It is there's a reason why it comes into being, starting with Edgar Allan Poe in the 1830s, and then gets going with Jules Verne and H.G. Wells right around the turn of the century there, 1860s, 1900, just as industrialization is getting going and we're entering the Anthropocene. There's a reason. Science fiction's, the job of it is to transform the cosmological picture into a mythological narrative. So the metaphysical function now has to do with a way in which those narratives or stories will touch on a spiritual dimension that is hidden from our physical senses. The world we see that is visible to our physical senses is the world of sense data, but a mythology that's a proper myth. And this is what differentiates myths from fairy tales. Fairy tales do not have this function in them, or folk tales. They're just stories. They may have a psychological function, in fact they usually do, and a sociological function, but they don't have, and sometimes even a cosmological function, but not quite. The cosmologies in fairy tales are mostly broken up shards and bits and pieces of the blown out cosmologies of the big civilizations. But the metaphysical function is what they don't have. And that involves touching another world that is beneath, beyond, behind, somewhere beyond the reach of the senses. But it has to shine through. It has to become, the physical world has to become transparent to the transcendent energies that come radiating through. And the great poets and artists who do this are individuals like Goethe or James Joyce or Thomas Pynchon. These are the types of great writers who make that, through their art, make that hidden transcendent world visible. So this is the third definition of metaphysics then, in which now what we have is not the kitschy New Age metaphysics, which is anti-intellectual. There's no mind in it. There are no philosophical concepts in it. Then the high philosophical academic tradition of Heidegger's metaphysical age from Plato to Nietzsche. And then we have this third definition, which is a philosophical orientation that is also simultaneously spiritual, as in the works, let's say, of thinkers like Rudolf Steiner, or Sri Aurobindo, or Teilhard de Chardin. These are grand metaphysicians, not just metaphysicians, because they have a spiritual vision that they are trying to render through their conceptual language. Now, the philosophers of that metaphysical arc from Plato down to Nietzsche are all metaphysicians, but they're not necessarily all spiritual. Some of them are atheists. Jeremy Bentham is an atheist, for instance. David Hume is an atheist. Still, though, a metaphysician. Wittgenstein, but Nietzsche wasn't particularly spiritually inclined either. He was an atheist. But nonetheless, they are metaphysicians. But in this third sense, I want to discuss metaphysics as high philosophical thinking wed to a properly spiritual view of the world that is interested in the other world, in other worlds than these, than the one that we're living in. And so Rudolf Steiner is a perfect exemplar of this. He's my all-time favorite thinker of this type. And he has a model of the subtle body that's worth thinking about as an example of this type of thinking, where he says that the human being is actually made up out of a series of kind of nested sheaths, one within the other. The outermost is the physical body, and the physical body is what we share in common with the minerals, the mineralogical world. Our bones are made out of minerals, and we've got metals and minerals in our metabolism and body, iron and copper and so forth, electricity. We have all of that in our physical body that we share in common with the mineral world. But we have something the mineral world doesn't have, namely an etheric body that animates our physical body. And this is what we share in common with the plants. So plants have etheric bodies, but they don't have further things that we have, as we'll see in a second. So the etheric body is that which is the morphogenetic function that grows and changes the body. And it's also, in human beings, tied in with memory. Steiner has, it's sort of memory in this, almost exactly in the sense in which Rupert Sheldrake meant this, with this idea of morphogenetic fields, which is a kind of cosmic memory. Everything, we don't just have memories, things have memories. Although Sheldrake doesn't make the distinction that Steiner makes here, that the etheric body has only to do with living things, because Sheldrake uses the morphogenetic fields to refer to anything. So the concept is too broad. It's not sharply differentiated enough, the way Steiner has done here with his high German intellect. So then we have also, animals have, what we share in common with animals is an astral body. Now an astral body, anything that has a nervous system has an astral body within it. And the astral body has to do with dreams. It is partially, what happens when we go to sleep at night is that the astral body leaves the physical and etheric bodies. Now, if the etheric body left the physical body, then you die. So the etheric body can't, until death, leave the physical body, but the astral body can. It's a little bit like the Egyptian concept of the Ba, the human-headed bird that leaves the tomb and flies out into the astral plane, and then can come back. So this astral body then leaves the physical body and goes out into the cosmos, and its interaction with the cosmos is in a different dimension than this physical one, than this spatiotemporal causal dimension. This is the world that is truly metaphysical. This is the astral plane, and that's where the astral body goes. So we have these three components in common with the mineral world, in common with the plant world, in common with the animal world. It's a chain of being for Steiner, and each one of them has a component that the previous one does not have. Now, likewise with us, we have something that the animals don't have, and in fact that nothing else has, which is an ego. Now, by ego, Steiner does not mean what Freud and Jung mean by ego, which is just simply the reality function. For Freud, the ego is simply what allows you to make physical decisions on the physical plane and guide you around, whereas for Jung, the ego is a kind of electron orbiting the nucleus of the psyche, of the self. It is the reality function, but for Steiner, the ego is more of a monad. It's more of a, it is that aspect of us which when we die then leaves and reincarnates. So he uses ego in a very different sense from the way that it's used by the philosophical thinkers of the metaphysical age, and Jung is one of them. He belongs in that group. Sort of, you could also make the argument that Jung belongs also in the third type of thinker that I'm talking about here, third type of sense of metaphysics. Although Jung did not like Rudolf Steiner, he thought Steiner's whole philosophical system was a joke. He didn't believe in any astral body, but Jung got himself into a bit of a bind there because he wound up with a big problem on his hands being a metaphysician, and there are people, thinkers like Slavoj Žižek, for instance, who don't take Jung seriously for precisely this reason. He got himself in a box because everything for him becomes psyche. Everything is a projection of the collective unconscious. The gods are projections of the psyche. The myths are projections of the psyche. Well, I got news for you. There's actually a world out there of gods and beings and angels that are not projections out of the collective unconscious. Jung is dead wrong about this. And he starts to realize it. You can tell as he goes along in his career that he starts to realize that there's a problem, because that's when he brings in the synchronicity idea later on in the 1950s, when he starts talking about, oh, well, how do we explain the appearance of coincidences, meaningful, acausal coincidences, where something in my mind simultaneously appears out there, or in a very coincidental mean. It doesn't have to be absolutely simultaneous. And so he comes up with the idea of synchronicity as there must be some way in which the mind and the world out there is connected. But he didn't say how, and he didn't theorize about it, but he was on to something there, but then I think he dropped the ball. Rudolf Steiner picks it up and runs with it, indeed. And I think Steiner got this right. When I initially read Steiner, I was skeptical about things like the afterlife and reincarnation and karma. So I read Steiner just as a grand metaphysician, or even as a poet, like someone like J.R.R. Tolkien, or something like that. Nowadays, I think Steiner got it absolutely 100% correct. My later researches have confirmed and validated Steiner's entire worldview and cosmology. So the ego for him, and we'll get into this when we get more into my cosmology that I've sort of figured out so far regarding the afterlife. But for Steiner, the ego then is the core monad that reincarnates from lifetime to lifetime. And then he goes through a whole bunch of, his last and greatest lecture series is called Karmic Relationships, that he gave just before he died. It's 8 volumes long, where he goes through the past lives. He had the ability, Steiner did, to read what he calls reading the Akashic record. That is the spiritual dimension where he could tell what other people's past lives were. He could read them. I have done this once with one individual, and I confirmed it later with a medium, so it was a bullseye. So, but I only did it once. So Rudolf Steiner he was a master, the maestro at reading people's past lives and really digging into that world. Another thinker like him would also be someone like Sri Aurobindo, with this type of metaphysics, with his idea of the descent of the supramental, which descends from above and lights up human consciousness, and also the idea that he's borrowed from a philosophical system called Sankhya, where the reincarnating monad is called a Purusha, and the Purusha is involved with matter, which is called Prakriti. And Prakriti is characterized by 3 different gunas: Sattva guna, which is pure clarity; Rajas guna, which is fiery, passionate activity; and its opposite, tamas guna, which is inertia, heavy energy. These three gunas are what characterize all matter. Also human types, human temperaments are also characterized by a predominance of one or the other in these. You can tell certain individuals are more slothful or lazy than others and therefore have a predominance of tamas guna. Certain individuals are much more fiery and passionate, short-tempered, and therefore have more of a predominance of rajas guna in them. This is how they account for, how Aurobindo accounts for the personality in this Indian philosophical metaphysical system, which is the kind of system that I'm talking about here, which for me, I'm a type of thinker that fits into metaphysics as this group. I can do the concepts and understand them, but I'm interested in knowledge of the higher worlds, to quote the title of one of Rudolf Steiner's books, Knowledge of the Higher Worlds. And so that is an overview. Now, one of the things I do want to make a distinction here between a cosmology, an ontology, a theogony, and a cosmogony. These are important terms to understand. A cosmology, as we've said, validates a certain world horizon, a knowledge of the world of a particular time and place. And it's not necessary, but an ontology can make a cosmology possible. Ontology has more to do with the high philosophy of the metaphysical age, where you have to have a theory of entities. If you're going to discourse philosophically, you have to have a theory of entities. What are entities to you? What do they mean? Do they have souls, or are they simply atoms? That's an ontology right there. There's an atomist ontology versus a soul ontology, or Aristotle's ontology of the four elements. For Aristotle, everything was made up out of earth, air, fire, and water, and consequently that, not atoms for him. Atomism came later with Democritus, and for him, alchemy then comes out of this. Alchemy is an Arabian science, a kind of metaphysically inclined science, which presupposes Aristotle's whole ontology of four elements, because these four elements are interconvertible one into the other. And if everything is made out of these four elements, then everything is interconvertible. One thing is interconvertible into another, and that is the basis for alchemy, which is based on a sort of fusing together of sulfur with mercury, sulfur with the combustible fiery aspect, mercury with the tricky liquid tricksterous aspect, and getting those two into a certain balance to produce the philosopher's stone was for them a way of liberating the spirit from its prison in matter. So it's the exact opposite of what the priest does during Mass when he calls forth the Logos and brings it down in to transubstantiate the wine and the wafer, which retain their physical appearances, but their substance now has been transubstantiated into the body and blood of Christ. That's the exact opposite. The alchemists were basically heretics in this sense, and they started dying out in the 17th century. For them, the spirit was in everything. And so the alchemical processes involved making the spirit visible through their alchemical flasks and vases and retorts and so forth like that. But then alchemy dies out because once atomism is discovered by men like Robert Boyle and Descartes, you can't do alchemy anymore if everything is made up of atoms, just homogeneous, value-neutral particles. Although Leibniz does come along right around in the late 17th century to provide an ingenious metaphysical transformation with his idea of monads, which is one of my favorite works of high spiritual metaphysical philosophy of all time, where he says that everything is made up out of these tiny little monads, which are basically souls, including matter for him, physical matter. Everything is a monad, and there are different kinds of monads, merely perceiving monads, apperceptive monads, all these different kinds of ways in which matter is conscious and aware for Leibniz, and then God for him becomes the sort of head monad, the giant monad, of which everything is all these replicated tiny copies. I love Leibniz. I love his. That's a philosophical transubstantiation of the atomism, of the atomist hypothesis. Okay, so that brings us to where I wanted to get with these three different types of metaphysics to answer the question, what is metaphysics? And next we'll pick up next time with Oswald Spengler, Gene Gebser, and historical meta-narratives.